20 head and a quiet house. Frost coated the fence wire like white lace, and the cattle's breath rose in pale clouds against an Ozark sky the color of old pewter. February had settled into the foothills of Arkansas the way it always did, slow, bitter, and without apology. The ground was iron beneath Amos Whitley's boots. The creek ran thin beneath a skin of ice. 20 head of cattle stood bunched at the feed line, steam curling from their dark hides, waiting on a man who hadn't slept past 4 a.m. since he could remember. Now, you have to understand something about Amos Whitley. He wasn't the kind of man who complained about loneliness. He was the kind who'd forgotten what noise sounded like, just plain forgot. The way you forget the taste of something you ain't eaten in years. He broke the ice in the water trough with the heel of his boot and forked hay until his shoulders burned. Lean as braided leather, hands scarred from wire and weather, he moved through chores the way a clock moves through hours, steady, mechanical, without anyone watching. His father had moved the same way through these same mornings, right up until the winter of '79, when the fever took him and left a 15-year-old boy with 20 cattle, a leaking roof, and a mother who cried only once before squaring her shoulders and teaching her son to mend fence in the snow. The homestead sat in a clearing between 2 wooded ridges, a cabin of hand-hewn oak, a leaning barn, a smokehouse that needed new chinking, small, clean, worn honest by weather and years. Inside, the front room held a cold hearth, a mending table stacked with tack leather, and 2 chairs that faced each other across a rag rug nobody sat on. Amos hadn't lit the hearth since October. No sense warming a room nobody used. He scraped his boots at the door and went to his mother's room. Ida Whitley lay propped on 2 pillows, her quilt pulled to her chin, her white hair braided the way she insisted upon, even though the braiding hurt her fingers now. She was 63 and had not left that bed in 4 months. "Brought you broth, Mama. I can smell it from here. Too much salt again. Ain't too much salt. Is if I say it is." He set the bowl on the side table and helped her sit straighter. Her hands shook when she took the spoon, and he looked away so she wouldn't see him notice. "Preacher's daughter is coming Tuesday," Ida said, between careful sips. "The new one, Charlotte, they call her. She's been visiting shut-ins around the valley." "That's so. I told Mrs. Greer at church I'd welcome it. She's gonna read to me." Amos nodded. "I'll be out with the cattle. You're always out with the cattle." He kissed her forehead, which was his way of ending conversations he didn't care to continue, and went back to the front room. The tack leather waited. The cold hearth stared at him like an empty eye. He sat down, threaded his needle, and worked in silence until the light failed. Outside, the frost deepened. Inside, not a sound but the pull of thread through leather, and, from the back room, his mother's breathing thin and papery as the pages of the books she could no longer hold. The voice through the wall. She knocked at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and Amos opened the door, still wearing his work coat and the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Charlotte Graves stood on the porch with a canvas satchel of books held against her chest and a smile that didn't seem to require his permission. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned sensibly beneath a wool bonnet and eyes the color of creek water in autumn clear brown. Warm even in the cold. "Mr. Whitley, I'm Charlotte Graves, Reverend Graves' daughter. Your mother's expecting me." "Yes'm." She mentioned it. He stepped aside without quite looking at her. "Back room, down the hall." "Thank you kindly." She moved past him, smelling of soap and cold air. And Amos stood at the door a moment longer than necessary before closing it. From the hallway, he heard Ida's voice lift like a bird startled into flight. "Oh, child, come in, pull that chair closer. My eyes ain't what they were, but I can see you're pretty as a new penny." Charlotte laughed, a small, surprised sound. "Mrs. Whitley, you're too kind. I brought psalms, but I also brought poetry and a book of stories about faraway places. If you'd rather travel beyond the valley for an afternoon." "Honey, I'd travel to the moon if you're the one reading the directions." Amos retreated to the front room. He picked up a bridle that needed new stitching and settled into his chair. The pine wall between the rooms was thin, barely an inch of wood, and Charlotte's voice came through it like lamplight through lace. She began with Psalm 23. Her reading was unhurried, clear, each word given its full weight, but none of them heavy. She didn't perform the words. She simply let them breathe, giving each one the space it deserved, as though the act of speaking them aloud was itself a kind of prayer. Amos's needle slowed. His hands went still over the leather. He told himself he wasn't listening. The reading lasted an hour. He heard Ida ask questions about Charlotte's girlhood back east, about the journey to Arkansas, about whether she preferred hymns or poetry. Charlotte answered each one with a patience that didn't feel practiced. Her voice carried a steadiness that reminded Amos of deep water calm on the surface, with something richer moving underneath. When Charlotte left, Amos was standing in the doorway of the front room, not quite in the hall, not quite hidden. She nodded to him as she passed. "Much obliged, Miss Graves," he managed. "I'll be back Friday, if that suits." "Suits fine." The door closed. Amos stood there, listening to her footsteps fade on the frozen ground. In the back room, Ida had fallen asleep wearing a half smile he hadn't seen in months. On the reading chair sat a small volume of poetry, its spine creased with use. Ida murmured from her pillow, half dreaming, "Thursday too." Amos looked at the empty chair and said nothing. But something behind his ribs shifted a door he'd nailed shut years ago, rattling faintly on its hinges. Tuesdays and Fridays, the second visit. Amos finished his cattle chores an hour early. He told himself the fence mending could wait. The third visit, he had a fresh pot of coffee ready on the stove, though nobody asked him to make it. Charlotte came Tuesdays and Fridays, regular as sunrise, and Amos built his weeks around those days the way a man builds fence around precious ground carefully, without admitting what he was protecting. She read Psalms first, always, then moved to Tennyson and Longfellow passages about oceans and mountains and cities where gaslights lined the avenues. Ida drank every word like cool water, and Amos sat in the next room with leather and needle and pretended the wall between them was thick enough to matter. It wasn't. Charlotte's voice was warm honey. That was the only way to put it. It poured through the pine boards and pooled in the corners of the front room, filling spaces Amos hadn't known were empty. He'd catch himself with the needle suspended mid-stitch, head tilted toward the wall, leather forgotten in his lap. Tuesday she read a passage from Tennyson about a brook that ran forever, and his hands stopped entirely. Friday she read a verse about autumn light, and he closed his eyes and let the words wash over him like warm rain. But it was the laughter that undid him. Third visit. A Friday afternoon. Ida was telling the one about the preacher who tried to baptize a mule. Amos had heard it 100 times. He mouthed the punchline from the next room, grinning in spite of himself. And when it landed, Charlotte laughed. Not the polite, held-back laugh of a visitor being gracious. This one came from somewhere deep, full-throated, and startled out of her, head tipped back. The kind of laugh that creased her eyes and shook her shoulders and made Ida clap her thin hands together with delight. The sound came through the wall and hit Amos in the chest like an open palm. His hands went dead still. The needle dropped into his lap. And that, right there, was the moment Amos Whitley was in real trouble. He just didn't know it yet. That Friday night, after Charlotte had gone and Ida slept, Amos sat alone in the front room. He looked at the cold hearth dark since October, stone gray with old ash. He stood up, got kindling from the box, got a match from the tin. The fire caught slow and built steady, throwing warm light across the rag rug and the 2 empty chairs. Amos sat back down and watched the flames for a long time. He told himself it was the cold snap. February had deepened. That's all. A man needed a fire in February. He was lying, and somewhere in the honest part of his heart, he knew it. What Mama sees Ida Whitley's world had narrowed to 1 room. But Lord have mercy, her eyes still worked just fine. She saw everything from that bed. She knew the time by the quality of light on the ceiling, pearl gray for morning, gold for afternoon, blue for the hour before dark. She knew Amos's moods by the weight of his boots in the hallway. She knew the weather by the song of wind against the eastern window. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who'd loved one good man for 37 years before burying him, that her son was falling in love with the preacher's daughter. The evidence was plain as daylight to anyone who cared to look. Amos shaved on Tuesdays, now hadn't shaved midweek in years. He'd lit the front room hearth, and it stayed lit on Charlotte's days. He brewed coffee without being asked. And 3 times now, Ida had caught him standing in the hallway doorway, not quite in the room, not quite gone, just lingering in that threshold, like a man who couldn't decide which direction to walk. Charlotte wasn't much better at hiding it. She smoothed her hair before coming inside. Ida could hear the quick fussing at the door, the pause before the knock. She brought a second book without being asked, and twice during readings. Charlotte's voice had caught on a word, nothing dramatic, just a half breath of hesitation, her eyes drifting toward the wall that separated her from the man pretending to mend tack on the other side. Once, after closing the poetry book. Charlotte sat still for a long moment, with her fingers pressed against the cover, as though she were holding something in place that might otherwise drift toward the next room. Ida watched it all with a heart caught between joy and ache. Joy because her son deserved this. Lord knew he'd earned it. 16 years of rising before dawn and never once complaining about the life that had been handed to him. Ache because she could feel her own body failing the coughing worse each week, the appetite thinning, the weight of the quilt growing heavier each morning. She was running out of time, and she knew it the way old people know things quietly, without drama, the way a candle knows it's shortening. "Charlotte, honey," Ida said during the 4th visit, "tell me something. What do you dream about when the day gets quiet?" Charlotte looked up from the book, surprised. "I suppose I dream about belonging somewhere. Mrs. Whitley, we've moved so many times with Papa's ministry. I'd like to stay put long enough to plant a garden and watch it come up in spring." Ida reached out and squeezed her hand. "You'd bloom fine right here, child. Soil's good in this valley." That evening, Ida called Amos to her bedside. "I want you to bring Charlotte coffee next time she comes. Set it on the reading table, nice-like, in the good cup." Amos stared at her as though she'd asked him to lasso the moon. "Mama, I don't think coffee, Amos. Not a marriage proposal, just coffee." He turned red around the ears and left without answering. But Tuesday morning, Ida heard the coffee pot rattling on the stove a full hour before Charlotte was due. She heard him take down the good cup, the blue one with the gold rim that had been his grandmother's, and set it carefully on the table. The sound of a man trying to be quiet about something that mattered enormously. That night, alone with the ceiling and the dark. Ida folded her hands on the quilt. "Lord," she whispered, "I ain't asking for much. Just one thing. Let me see him happy before I go. That's all I need. Just let me see it." The story about the sea. Charlotte read a passage about the Atlantic coast, that Tuesday waves breaking against granite cliffs, salt spray hanging in the air, gulls wheeling in a sky so wide it made the land seem small. Her voice carried the images through the wall and into Amos's chest like something warm and living that had found a place to rest. He'd moved his chair closer to the doorway without admitting it. Today he sat with his shoulder against the frame, half visible if anyone cared to look. He wasn't mending tack. He'd run out of tack to mend 3 days ago and had stitched the same harness leather twice over. Now he just held it a prop, a pretense, something for his hands to do while the rest of him listened. Charlotte closed the book. Ida had drifted to sleep, chin tucked against the quilt, breathing shallow and even. Charlotte sat still for a moment, her thumb tracing the book's spine, and then stood quietly and gathered her things. Amos was in the doorway. He hadn't planned to be there. His body had simply refused to retreat to the next room the way his mind insisted. Charlotte looked up and found him standing in the threshold, hands at his sides, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "That place you was reading about," Amos said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, rusty from disuse. "The sea. You ever seen it?" Charlotte's eyes widened. This was more words than he'd offered in 4 visits combined. "No," she said softly. I haven't. Papa always ministered inland. I've imagined it, though, many times. What do you reckon it sounds like? She considered this with her head tilted slightly, the way she considered everything, as though his question deserved her whole attention, as though a poor rancher's curiosity about the ocean was worth pausing for. I think it might sound like wind through tall pines, she said, only a good deal wetter. Something moved in Amos's face, the shadow of a smile there and gone, like sunlight through a crack in cloud cover. Only wetter, he repeated. I'm fairly certain of that part. The silence between them was not empty. It was warm like the hearth he'd lit for her, like the room he'd made ready without being asked. Charlotte held his gaze for one breath, two, and in those seconds something passed between them that neither could have named, and both understood completely. Then she nodded gently and moved past him toward the door, and he caught the faintest scent of soap and wool and winter air. Good evening, Mr. Whitley. Evening, Miss Graves. Have you ever wanted something so badly you convinced yourself you didn't deserve it? That was Amos Whitley. Standing in that doorway every single evening, watching her walk down the path toward the road until she disappeared around the bend. That night he lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about waves he'd never seen and a voice like warm honey describing them. He thought about 20 head of cattle and a leaking roof and the bank notice folded in his Bible. He thought about his father, dead at 42. Buried in the hard ground behind the barn, a man who'd worked himself hollow, trying to make this land enough for a family. Amos remembered standing at that grave as a boy, promising himself he'd never ask anyone to share a life this thin. The promise felt different now. It felt like a wall he'd built to keep something out, only to discover it was keeping him in. By morning, he'd made his decision. Friday, he'd stay out with the cattle. He'd keep his distance. Before this went any further and made a fool of them both. The storm came down off the ridges on Thursday night ice and wind that stripped the branches bare and turned the road into a river of frozen mud. By Friday morning, nobody was traveling anywhere. Charlotte didn't come. Amos told himself it was fine. He said it once to the cattle and once to the mirror, and neither one believed him. He worked through the storm with a fury that surprised even himself, hauling water through knee-deep drifts, checking fence in wind that cut through his coat like a blade, wrapping burlap around the younger calves with hands so numb he couldn't feel the knots. The work was brutal and honest, and it kept his body occupied. His mind was another matter entirely. Inside, Ida worsened. The cough deepened into something wet and rattling that woke Amos twice in the night. Her appetite vanished. She drank broth only when he held the spoon steady and waited. And even then she managed only a few swallows before turning her face toward the wall. The house pressed in on him smaller, darker, emptier than before Charlotte had ever knocked on the door. You can't miss what you never had. Except you could. Amos was learning that now, in the hardest way possible. Saturday evening, the wind died. The silence that replaced it was worse. Amos went to the reading chair and picked up the poetry book, Charlotte's book, the one she left between visits. He turned it in his hands, studying the worn spine, the pages soft from use. He tried to imagine which poem she would have chosen. She always started with something gentle for Ida, then moved to something wider. Tennyson, maybe, or that passage about autumn light Ida loved. He carried the book to his mother's bedside and sat down in Charlotte's chair. Ida opened her eyes. "Thought I'd read you something, Mama, if you want." Ida's face softened. "I'd like that, son." He opened to a page marked with a ribbon, Charlotte's ribbon, pale blue, smelling faintly of the soap she used, and began to read. His voice stumbled. The rhythm that came so naturally to Charlotte eluded him. He tripped over line breaks, swallowed words that deserved air, turned music into something halting and effortful. But he kept going, because his mother was listening, and the silence was worse. When he finished, Ida reached out and covered his hand with hers. Her fingers were thin as bird bones. "That was lovely, son." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and they both knew what was missing. It wasn't better pronunciation or smoother rhythm. It was the voice that had turned this house into a different place, a place where the walls felt closer in a good way, like being held instead of confined. Amos set the book down. He did not light the front room hearth. He sat alone with the needle and the already mended leather, pulling thread through holes that didn't need it, and listened to the wind throw ice against the windows. Sunday dawned pale and still. The storm had broken overnight, leaving the world glazed and glittering under a sky scrubbed clean. Amos stood on the porch with coffee steaming in his hands and looked down the road. A figure appeared at the bend, bundled in wool, picking her way through the ice with careful steps, a canvas satchel clutched against her chest. Charlotte Graves. A day early, 2 miles on a frozen road because she'd missed a visit and couldn't bear to wait for Tuesday. Amos's hands tightened around the tin cup. The coffee sloshed over the rim, and he didn't notice. "She's speaking to you." Charlotte came inside with pink cheeks and ice crystals on her bonnet and paused in the front room just long enough to unwrap her scarf. Her eyes moved to the hearth, dark, unlit, cold as the room around it, and something flickered across her face, a small thing, a private thing. The briefest tightening around her mouth, as though the cold hearth told her something she'd been afraid to hear. Then she straightened her shoulders and went to Ida's room like she'd been walking that hallway her whole life. "Oh, child," Ida's voice lifted from the pillows. "I thought the storm swallowed you whole." "Just delayed me, Mrs. Whitley. I brought a new collection. Shall we start?" Amos stood in the hallway. Every instinct told him to go to his chair, to listen through the wall, to let the voice pour through the pine boards and pretend it was enough. Instead, he put on his coat and walked outside. He stayed with the cattle all morning. Charlotte's voice carried through the cabin window, fainter now, thinner, reaching for something across the distance that kept pulling away. He turned his back and mended fence that didn't need mending, and told himself this was the right decision, the safe decision, the only decision a man with nothing could make. Charlotte left quieter than usual. Amos watched from the barn doorway and did not wave. That evening, supper was silent. Ida ate 3 spoonfuls of broth and pushed the bowl away. Amos washed the dishes and dried them and hung the towel on its nail with the careful precision of a man holding himself together, one task at a time. "Amos," his mother's voice from the back room, not weak, not tired, clear as a church bell on a cold morning. He went to her. She was sitting straighter than she had in weeks, propped on her own strength, her eyes sharp with the look he recognized from childhood, the look that meant truth was coming, whether you were ready for it or not. "Sit down, son." He sat on the edge of her bed, hat in his hands from habit. She looked at him for a long time, and in her gaze he saw 37 years of marriage, 16 years of widowhood, and a lifetime of watching people she loved make choices out of fear. "Son, that girl reads to me," Ida said quietly, "but she's speaking to you." The blood rose from Amos's collar to his hairline, red as a February sunset. "Mama, don't you mama me. I got eyes. Amos, I seen you light that hearth. I seen you shave on a Tuesday for the first time in 3 years. I seen you wear holes in perfectly good leather just to have a reason to sit on the other side of that wall." She paused. "And I seen that girl look toward the wall every time she turns a page, hoping you're there. I ain't got nothing to offer her. Mama, you know that. Your father had 20 cattle and a leaking roof when he came calling on me. You know what he offered." She reached out and pressed her palm flat against Amos's chest, right over his heart. "This, right here. And I never once wanted for a single thing more." Amos couldn't speak. His throat closed around something too large and too old to swallow years of early mornings and empty rooms and the bone-deep belief that love was a luxury meant for men with better land. "Pride and poverty make cold bedfellows," Ida said, her voice gentler now. "I've watched enough loneliness fill this house. Son, I've breathed it in like dust. Don't you choose it. Not when something warm is standing right there on the other side of the wall." He sat with her until she slept. Then he sat with her words, alone in the dark front room. The hearth burnt down to embers. "Now, I need you to understand what happened next, because it was the smallest thing in the world, and it cost Amos Whitley everything he had." Before dawn, he walked the frozen field. The ground was iron hard beneath a skin of frost. The grass brittle and white. But at the fence line, God's own quiet miracle, one small wildflower had pushed through the frozen earth, purple and stubborn and impossibly alive, trembling in the cold air like it didn't know it wasn't supposed to be there. Amos knelt, his rough fingers closed around the stem with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. Picking a flower is easy. Admitting what it means that takes everything a man's got. He carried it inside. He knew exactly where it belonged. Valentine's morning, February the 14th, dawned clear and cold, and Amos Whitley was up before the stars faded. He rode to the Dawson place at first light and sold the roan calf, the good one, the one he'd been saving for spring market. $12, more than he could rightly spare, every cent of it shaking in his coat pocket as he turned the horse toward town. He arrived at the general store before Mr. Hadley had finished his morning coffee. "Mornin', Amos." Hadley studied him over the rim of his cup. "Ain't seen you in town on a weekday and well, I ain't sure I ever have." I need a book. Hadley set down his coffee with the careful slowness of a man who knew better than to make a fuss over a miracle. What kind of book? A novel. Something about faraway places, oceans, maybe foreign lands. Hadley turned to the shelf behind the counter, running his finger along spines until he stopped at a blue cloth volume with gold lettering, a story set on the coast of Cornwall. Waves and cliffs and a world as far from the Ozark foothills as a man could imagine. This one's real popular back east, Hadley said, wrapping it in brown paper. He rang up the purchase and slid it across the counter and said nothing else, because some things a man does on Valentine's morning don't require commentary. Amos rode home, sat at the kitchen table with the book and the pressed wildflower and his hands that would not stop trembling. He opened the front cover and laid the flower inside centered. Careful, its purple petals bright against the cream-colored page. No note. What would he write? Everything he needed to say was already living in that small, stubborn bloom that had pushed through frozen ground because growing was what it was made to do. He closed the book and placed it on the reading chair. Then he lit the hearth. The kindling caught and the flames climbed, and warm light spread across the front room like an answered prayer. He shaved with cold water and a steady hand. Put on the clean shirt Ida had sewn him last Christmas, the one he'd been saving, though he couldn't have said what he'd been saving it for until now. He combed his hair with wet fingers and stood before the mirror and met his own eyes and saw something there he barely recognized. Not a different man, the same man, with the door behind his ribs finally standing open. You're not ready for what happens next. Then again, neither was Amos. 10 o'clock. A knock. Charlotte stood on the porch in her Sunday bonnet, cheeks flushed from the walk, satchel pressed against her chest. She opened her mouth to greet him and then stopped. Her eyes moved over him, the clean shirt, the fresh-shaved jaw, the warm light pouring from the front room behind him, the hearth blazing where it had been cold the visit before. Something shifted in her face, understanding, maybe, or the beginning of it. "Mornin', Miss Graves. There's a new book on the chair. For Mama." She stepped inside, set her satchel down, saw the blue volume on the reading chair and picked it up, turning it in her hands, running her fingers across the gold lettering with a curiosity that was almost tender. She opened the cover, not to the first page, to the frontispiece, the way readers do when they're savoring a new book, examining the title page, the publisher's mark, the weight of the paper. She turned past the frontispiece to the first blank page. The wildflower lay there, small, purple, pressed with a care that said everything a $12 book and a lifetime of silence could not. Charlotte's hands went still. Her breath caught a sound so quiet it barely existed. But in the silence of that room, it was the loudest thing Amos had ever heard. She looked up. Amos stood in the doorway, the same threshold he'd haunted for weeks, hat in his hands, heart laid open, unable to speak and unable to look away. 3 steps between them. 3 steps and an entire lifetime of believing he had nothing worth offering. Her fingers closed around the stem. Her eyes filled with light that had nothing to do with the fire. The whole room held still the flames. the dust motes, the cold February air pressing against the windows, everything suspended in the space between a question asked without words and an answer given the same way. Charlotte smiled. Love drifts in soft. Charlotte lifted the wildflower from the page and tucked it behind her ear, settling it against her dark hair where it rested like a small purple flame. She didn't speak. Neither did Amos. There are moments that words would only diminish, moments that live in the space between two people who've been listening to each other through walls and silence and the careful turning of pages for weeks, building something neither of them had the courage to name until a single pressed flower named it for them. She sat down in the reading chair, smoothed her skirt, opened the blue book to page 1, and began to read. Her voice filled the room the way it always did, warm and steady, reaching into corners, pooling in the spaces between things. But something had changed in its direction. The words that had always been aimed at Ida now carried a current that traveled through the doorway and down the hall, and found the man who had been hiding on the other side of a pine wall for the better part of a month. Amos did not go to the next room. For the first time, he lifted the chair from his mending table and carried it to the bedroom doorway. Set it down right there in the threshold, half in Ida's room, half in the hallway, half in one world and half in another, and sat. No tack leather in his lap, no needle between his fingers, no pretense and no prop, just a man who had finally, after all this time, stopped pretending he wasn't listening. Charlotte's voice held steady, but Amos saw her fingers tighten on the book's spine. She turned a page, read about the coast of Cornwall cliffs and seabirds and waves that sounded, maybe, like wind through tall pines, only wetter. She turned another page, and her eyes lifted from the words and met his across the small room, and he held her gaze, and he stayed. Ida watched from her pillow. Her old eyes moved from Charlotte's face, the wildflower bright against her dark hair, to her son's face. Open and unguarded for the first time in years she could count. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like watching a conversation spoken in a language older than words. Ida drew a long, slow breath. She pressed her hand against her chest, where her heart was beating, and turned her face toward the window so they wouldn't see the tears slipping down her creased cheeks. Not sad tears. The other kind. The kind that come when a prayer you whispered into the dark comes back answered in daylight. Her boy. Found. The hearth crackled in the front room, sending warmth down the hall in steady waves. The February cold pressed against the windows, but could not get in, not today, not into this house, not anymore. 20 head of cattle stood quiet in the field outside, breath rising in pale clouds against a sky that was, for the first time in weeks, beginning to soften toward blue. The homestead that had opened this story in frost and silence now glowed from within lamplight, golden through the glass. A reading voice filling every room, 3 people bound together by warmth and story, and the simple, stubborn miracle of showing up. Love don't always come knocking at the front door. Sometimes it drifts in soft through a reading voice on a cold winter night, And if you're wise enough to stop pretending you're not listening, well, that's when everything changes. Outside, the Ozark hills lay silver with frost beneath a clearing sky. Inside, the fire burned. Charlotte read. Amos listened. And between the pages of a blue book with gold lettering, pressed where the story began, a single wildflower held the whole future small, stubborn, and impossibly alive.